I'd like to look at the beginning and the end of the book with two questions. Why is it that 1st and 2nd Samuel begins with, which has to do with the story of kingship, why does it begin with the call of Samuel, the judgment of God on Eli, who is the chief priest, the descendant of Aaron, and the loss of the ark? Now that's the question. Why does it tell this? 4 main points here, and this is very important for the whole book. Number 1, Samuel is the last of the judges. He's the forerunner of all the prophets who come, and he is the kingmaker. He is the founder of the kingship. Now that's the first 2 points. Let's have a look at those passages. First of all, chapter 7, 5 to 17. Samuel is the last of the judges. David? 1 Samuel 7 through to 17.
5 to 17. Then Samuel said, "Assemble all Israel at Mizpah, and I will intercede with the Lord for you." When they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. On that day they fasted, and they confessed, "We have sinned against the Lord." And Samuel was leader of Israel at Mizpah.
Now notice the footnote there. It was leader of Israel. He was judge of Israel. He judged Israel. That's the Hebrew.
When the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. And when the Israelites heard of it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. They said to Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines." Then Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered it up as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to a point below Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen, and he named it Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far has the Lord helped us." So the Philistines were subdued and did not invade Israelite territory again. Throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. The towns from Ekron to Gath that the Philistines had captured from Israel were restored to her, and Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the power of the Philistines, and there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel continued as judge over Israel all the days of his life. From year to year he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah where his home was, and there he also judged Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord.
Now, I don't know whether you got the point of this story. Samuel is the last of the judges. He judges Israel. He's the leader of Israel. But he leads Israel in battle in a different way to all the other judges. How did all the other judges lead in battle? They got an army together and they went out the front. Now, how does Samuel lead Israel?
Worship.
By presenting offerings to God on the altar and interceding for them by prayer.
The ark was going before.
The ark was in Philistine territory. There's no ark there. Yeah, but it's a similar thing.
Similar. The ark is God is going
here.
Samuel was in prayer going before.
So hence you get the emphasis on him building an altar. Right at the beginning, he offers sacrifices, he prays for the people, and then the Israelite army doesn't have to do any fighting. Why? Because God fights for them. Remember, that was the story at the Red Sea. Right? He's a judge with a difference to the previous judges. He's the last of the judges, but he's also a prophet and a kingmaker. You know the story of the call of Samuel. Remember the boy Samuel at the temple? He doesn't come from a priestly family. His mother can't have children. She promises to give, if she has a son, she'll give her son to the Lord. And then he is given to the Lord and he becomes a priest then by adoption. Not by birth, but by adoption. And then he is called to be a prophet. Let's go to the summary verses there of the story of his call to be a prophet. Please, Dylan, can you read chapter 3, 20 to 21?
3:20. There we go. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word.
Remember, he was called as a young boy, and then he is a prophet. He is the prophet in Israel. He works as a prophet at Shiloh, that holy place, the place where the ark is, the place where the tabernacle is, the place where Eli is chief priest. And as a prophet, then he is the kingmaker in Israel, but he is also the king breaker. He deposes Saul. Now, thirdly, God's judgment on Eli as high priest in Shiloh is a prelude to his establishment of a new dynasty of priests in Jerusalem under a new figure called Zadok, rather than as a descendant of Eli from Shiloh. Remember when the Philistines attacked, the two sons of Eli went in front of the ark went into the battle, the two sons were killed, the ark was captured, and that was the end of Eli's family. And you remember that God brought this judgment on Eli and his family because they helped themselves to the offerings that belonged to the Lord, and they had sex with the women that were involved in caring for cleaning the sanctuary. And they had sex within that holy area. They desecrated God's holiness, therefore God rejects them from the priesthood. And he rejects the family of family of Eli. Okay, we get a reference to this in chapter 2, verse 33. Dylan, since you had a short reading, can you read 2:35, not 2:33?
2:35.
2:35.
I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always.
Now, my anointed one is my Messiah, my Christ. Who is God's anointed one? Is David. So God rejects Eli and his sons from the priesthood, and he prophesies that he will raise up a new priest, a faithful priest, who will serve together with his anointed one, together with his king in the future. Lastly, the first part of 1st and 2nd Samuel begins with the loss of the ark. Now, that's a prelude to the restoration of the ark from the Philistines and David's bringing of the ark to Jerusalem, which is then the place where at the end of the book he builds the altar, and that's the place where around that altar and around that ark Solomon builds the temple. So, we don't have time to read those passages, but you know the story of the ark there and its loss. So that's why the books of Samuel begin where they do. Notice the emphasis here is on worship, not on kingship. Let's go to the end of these two books, which are a cluster taken together, and see the final story. 2 Samuel 24. 2 Samuel 24. Now, there's much here that's unusual and odd for us. It's the story of the census that David took. Now, we've had a book where we've had 2 censuses already. Which book was it where we had a count of 2 censuses?
Numbers.
Right? Numbers. In Numbers, God tells Moses and Aaron to take a census for 2 purposes. The first one was to organise the Israelite army, to find out how many men there were of military age in each tribe, each family, each clan. And secondly, do you remember what the second census was for? For the distribution of the land. Now, you need to know that behind both of those censuses lies God. God, through Moses and through his priest Aaron, conducts his census on Israel. Now, what's gone wrong here? David, at the peak of his power, does something which is quite understandable from a military and political point of view. He's not only a king over the tribes of Israel, but he has accidentally acquired an empire. He rules over other non-Israelite people. Now, if you're going to rule over an empire, what do you need?
You need to know who they all are.
You need to know who they are, but for practical purposes, what's the bottom line? If you're going to keep control over not only of your own nation, but conquered nations,
you have to have a force to...
You have to have a force. You have to have an army. Up to this point, Israel had no standing army. Do you realise that? They had a tribal militia. If there was trouble, they would call up young men, all that were available, and they would then cobble together an army. But if you're going to maintain an empire, you need that won't work because it's inefficient, and you can't train people to be officers. You can't train them to work together, to fight together. What you need is a standing army. So what David wants is a standing army, an officer corps, and he wants to know who the men are, to have a list of people so that when the war comes, when he needs it, he can call them up. They are reservists who can be called up by the king at any point. Now, what's wrong with David taking a census? Can you see why God's judgment comes on David because of this act?
Lack of trust.
Not only lack of trust in God,
but he's doing it himself, whereas God usually leads them. Leads them. He's now...
He is doing what
God does.
What God does. He's acting as if he is God. He's acting as if he's God. And he's trying to displace God. Who is the only person who is allowed to take a census in Israel? God. How does he do it? Through his priest. Now, David, of his own initiative, takes a census. Now, the result of this census, which was for those military purposes, can you understand why it is? Yeah. God's judgment comes on David. And this is where the story begins. Let's pick it up towards the middle of the story.
Chapter 24.
Chapter 24, verse 10 following.
Was it you, Dylan? Or?
David, chapter 24, 2 Samuel. Yes,
oh,
no, you. Sorry.
Yeah. No. David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, O Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to Gad, the prophet, David's seer. Go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you.
Now, if ever there were Clayton's options, these were it's not only between a rock and a hard place, it's between the devil, the deep blue sea, and the devil. Yes.
So Gad went to David and said to him, Shall there come upon you 3 years of Shall there come upon you 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land?
Right, now there's 3 options. One is 3 years of drought. That's then the second one is 3 months of being defeated by enemies, not just persecution, but just a defeat after defeat after defeat. So 3 months of defeat, or 3 days of an epidemic. So those 3 options. Okay, keep going.
Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me. Poor bloke.
Yep.
David said to Gad, I am in deep distress.
I can understand him. What an understatement.
Yeah. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great. But do not let me fall into the hands of men. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of the time designated. And 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died.
That's from the north to the south. 70,000 were destroyed in this epidemic. Now, that's not the end of the story.
When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord was grieved because of the calamity, and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, Enough, withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite.
Now notice there, it's that translation's not quite good. It's enough. Withdraw your hand is not saying stop. Stop here, but just halt, pause. Okay. So the plague sweeps across the land, but up to this point, what's the only part of the kingdom that's been spared? Jerusalem. That's where David is. That's where the capital city. So up to this point, Jerusalem has been spared, and the angel of death is there, just outside the city. And you need to see that, you need to understand the geography of Jerusalem to see what's going on. The city of David was built on an amazing natural site, easily fortified. Steep cliffs on 3 sides, deep valley here. Okay, this is a ridge, a hill, a flat top, but this is lower and it goes up here. Now the city of David is here, and there's a wall here. Just outside the city there is a hill here, which is the highest point, and then there's a drops up after there, and this is where the threshing floor of Araunah is. This is where there is a flat rock, a big flat rock which is bigger than this room, which was used to thresh grain at this time. So it's up the city, just outside the city. So the angels come here on top of this hill overlooking Jerusalem. This is the threshing floor, yes?
Sorry, can you just explain the map again? Is any of that water, or is that...
No, there's no water here, but there's 2 springs with really amazing water supply. There's a spring here, and then there's a spring here.
They're hills, those big...
This is a hill, a ridge. Steep sides, flat top. So it's a good site for a city.
It's like a plateau.
It's like a plateau. Yeah. Just look at it, if you can, some pictures of the city of Jerusalem. A lot of the gullies here have been filled in with rubble since the time. But this is the Mount of Olives. Remember, Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. This is this side. Mount Scopus is up here. And there's another hill here, not a mountain this side. This is the deepest valley. This is a shallower valley. This is valley. Okay, valley.
This is a top-down view.
Sorry, what?
Top down.
It's a top-down view.
This is a top-down view, a map. You with me? It's not a profile.
That's not
Okay, according to profile, you get like this. No, this is a bit lower. Okay, this is side-on cross-section. Right, steep sides, but then the ridge goes up this way. Deep valley. And Jerusalem here is on this part of that hill or plateau. Okay? Now, do you know what the significance of this threshing floor is and that rock? You can see it to the present day. Yeah? This is the Mount of Olives here. Yep.
Is that where the altar was?
This is where the altar was built, and we're going to hear about it. It was built on that rock.
Is that
That's the site of then what?
The temple.
The temple, and what's there now?
Dome of
The Muslim-
Rock.
The Muslim Dome of the Rock. And you get the Wailing Wall, which is the retaining wall. Now this is on top of the hill here, the highest point of this ridge.
Like Assassin's Creed.
What?
Oh,
There's a game that has these ancient cities, but during the medieval times,
Yes,
you
yes.
can just walk around them and stuff.
Yes.
Apparently the computer games is where we get our history from now.
Yes. Well, at least you get it, some of it, even if it's not entirely adequate. Let's go on. Tony, keep going. So the angel is standing somewhere up here by the threshing floor, and Gad is the prophet. Okay, keep going.
When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my family.
Okay, now David comes here, and David sees the angel, and he prays, he intercedes for these people here, and he says, he puts his life on the line, and says, you spare the people, but kill me.
So he goes to the altar and gives himself.
Well, there's no altar there yet.
Oh,
This is the rock.
where it will be.
So this is where the altar is going to be. Keep going.
So he's okay. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, Go up and build an altar to the Lord at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. So David went up, as the Lord had commanded through Gad. When
Araunah.
Araunah, okay. Looked and saw the king and his men coming toward him. He went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, Why has my lord the king come to his servant? To buy your threshing floor, David answered, so I can build the altar to the Lord, that the plague of the people may be stopped.
Okay, now there's the angel of death here has stopped. He hasn't gone away. David sees the angel, he prays with the angel, and now he buys this area from Araunah because he wants to put an altar there. And what's the purpose of the altar?
To worship God and seek forgiveness.
To stop the plague. So by presenting an offering and by praying, the plague is going to be stopped, and the Jerusalem, the holy city, which is going to be spared. Go to the end of the chapter. From verse 24 in the middle. So David, to the end of the book.
So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped.
Right, so what David does, there's the angel here threatening the city. David prays, and he builds an altar and presents the offering. What happens because David prays and presents offerings? The plague is removed. Ceased. Now that sets a precedent for the future because that altar is the altar of the Jerusalem temple. What's the connection between the altar and kingship? Well, this is the king's altar. Here not only David, but all of David's descendants are going to pray for who?
All Israel.
All Israel. And they're going to offer sacrifices for Israel so that God's judgment won't come on Israel, and God's putting it positively. Instead of judgment, what will come on Israel? Blessing on Israel. Do you see? And that's the basic role of the king. So what's the function of the king that lies behind this story, David?
To worship.
Put it in Old Testament terms. What is the function of a king as told in this story? The king who lives, this is the capital city. There's going to be a temple built here, and alongside that temple, Solomon's going to build his palace. So you have temple and palace here. Yep.
The king intercedes for the people.
The king not only intercedes for the people, but presents offerings for the people at the altar, so that God's judgment will turn away from his people, so that God won't judge them for his sins or their sins, and so that both the king and the nation will receive God's blessing.
So the king in turn becomes a priest?
No, because he doesn't actually present the offerings. He doesn't get onto the altar. He's the one who brings the offerings. He brings the prayers.
Is that
There's a big, and we'll come to this, kingship and priesthood are two separate things in Israel, and you need to see that they are completely separated. Yes, Garth?
No, I don't like
Steve?
I was just thinking Jesus then does both as king.
Righto, he is not just king, but he's also priest and he's prophet. He's prophet, priest and king. What was separated in the history of Israel comes together then late in Christ. Kingship, prophecy and priesthood, separate things. And the whole of the prophetic history shows how they were kept separate by God to stop spiritual power being abused. But they come together in Jesus, who is our prophet, priest and king. Now, so why does the story of kingship end with the construction of the altar at the threshing floor of Araunah? Number one, and most obviously, it answers the criticism by people in Israel about the temple in Jerusalem. If you think historically and traditionally, where is the place that David and Solomon should have built the temple? At Bethel. Why?
That's where all the ancestors and all that stuff.
Okay, actually, so where were the first altars built? Shechem up here. That's where, and Bethel. So those are the two ancient sanctuaries, altars. Bethel and Shechem. Now, once the kingdom split, where did Jeroboam build the altar in the northern kingdom? Not at Shechem, but at Bethel. Bethel, you need to know. Just notice that when you come to Kings, going right back to Abraham, Shechem, to the present day, is the home of the Samaritans. The Samaritans still had an altar there in the time of Jesus, and they were worshipping God at Shechem. Do you remember the story in John chapter 4 of the woman at the well? That's at Shechem. And she says, do we worship God in this place, Shechem? That's what the Samaritans claimed, or down there in Jerusalem, Jebush. And Jesus says, no, we have a new place of worship. What's the new place of worship? Jesus himself, his body, which is the temple of God. So this is the foundational story of the temple in Jerusalem. It gives the legitimacy of the temple. Why was there an altar built here? Why was there temple built here? Because God had told David how? Through the prophet Dan. Notice the role of the prophet here. It's Dan the prophet who says, God tells you to build an altar here. And so David builds the altar. So David is the altar builder at Jerusalem. Solomon is the temple builder. The second point that's being made, and that's going to be important for 1st and 2nd Kings, is the connection between the monarchy, kingship, and the altar, and with the altar, the temple in Jerusalem. One of the jobs of the king is to make sure that the temple works the way it's meant to work, to take care of the temple and the priests who lead the nation in worship. Thirdly, the king is the patron of the temple. He provides the sacrifices and the offerings, which then the priests sacrifice to avert God's wrath from the kingdom and to ensure his blessing of them. That's the whole nation. Now, taken as a whole, what's the purpose of the book? And I want to bring that at the front rather than at the end. The book shows the origin of the monarchy and the royal dynasty of David in Israel, and outlines the role of Israel's kings as patrons of worship in Jerusalem, this last story. Any questions on that? So let's start off then in some of the themes of these two books. And I want to pick out two main themes. The first theme is the theme of prophecy. And the second one is kingship. So what do these books have to do with? Prophecy and kingship. Number one, 1st and 2nd Samuel tells us about the role of the prophets in the foundation of the monarchy. Just look how important the prophets are. They have their finger in all the important pies here. First of all, look at the important actions of Samuel, the first of the prophets. He was the one who announced God's judgment on Eli and his sons, Eli's family. He is the one who anointed Saul as king. Through Samuel, God chose Saul. Through Samuel, God anointed Saul. He is the one whom God chose to reject Saul. So he speaks God's word of judgment on Saul. He anoints David as king, remember? And then even when he's dead, he still acts as a prophet. You remember at the end of Saul's life, the Philistines are attacking. Saul is desperate. He tries to find some prophet to intercede for him, to find out what's going to happen in the battle. He can't find any prophet. He can't even find any fortune teller, any witch, until he discovers that there is one witch still left in Endor, by secret police. He goes there and he gets that witch to conjure up the ghost of Samuel. And Samuel's ghost then announces the death of Saul and the defeat of Saul in battle. So Samuel is the kingmaker. Samuel's role is decisive. Yes.
I'm just wondering, the fact that he was trying to talk to a dead person, is that, could that be sort of mirrored in what the Catholics do when they pray to dead people?
Even Catholics don't use this because it's obviously dodgy stuff going on here.
Yeah.
And notice that it's not approved of in the Old Testament. According to the law of Moses, anybody who is a witch should be put to death. And this is a negative story. If you do track with witches, watch out what's going to come to you. You come under God's judgment, the way Saul did. Yes.
Then how come if Moses had that law of how the people should be killed, witches and all that kind of stuff? Why does then Samuel appear to Saul? Because that always seems like a contradictory.
I know. There's lots of stuff I don't understand, Garth, and maybe you'll go beyond me, but I doubt whether you'll get any further on that one than I. There's some things.
Is Saul in seeking that witch's blessing? That's another god.
That's right. It's idolatry. It's apostasy. It's he could have gone to a prophet and it would have been quite legitimate.
But the prophet would have given the exact same thing.
That he would have said exactly the same thing. Secondly, the second important prophet is Nathan. Now notice the role of Nathan as a prophet. First of all, and this is the most important role of Nathan, through Nathan, God makes his covenant with David and his family, his descendants. Secondly, through Nathan, God announces his judgment on David for adultery with Bathsheba and killing her husband Uriah. David the great sinner is also, David the great holy king is also the sinful king. He's guilty of adultery and murder. But he never breaks which commandment? The first commandment. He's guilty of the two worst second commandment sins, adultery and murder. And so through Nathan, God comes to David and says, you are the man, and he announces God's judgment on David and his family. You know the story. Then thirdly, through Nathan, God does something strange. He gives, when Bathsheba has a baby, this adulteress whom David marries, he goes to David and says that he is to be given the name Jedediah, which means beloved of God, indicating that God has chosen this son of David, who is not the older son, he's number 10 of David's sons, who comes from the result of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, is going to be his successor, the Messiah, the anointed one. Thirdly, through Nathan, through Gad, God announces his judgment on David for the censors and commands David to do what 2 Samuel says is the most important thing that David ever did. What's the most important thing that David ever did? He built the altar here on the threshing floor of Araunah.
Did David also build the temple? Or
No, so that's Solomon. If you go to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, he did all the planning for it.
Okay.
What David did was to set up a tent in Jerusalem for the ark in the city, and that was preliminary to the temple, and he then built this altar. But it's Solomon who built the temple and brought the ark from that tent into this permanent place. Now, early next week, I want to deal with the theology of kingship in Israel, which is the main point here. It might help if you look through this in advance, because there's very important stuff. Now, why is this so important? Do you know what our basic Christian confession of faith is, Dylan?
Creed.
Well, what's the heart of the creed? Yes? Jesus is who? The Messiah. Son of God, Lord. That's our basic confession of faith. But partly of a basic confession of faith is that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. Do you know what Christ means, David?
No.
Now, this is something you need to know very clearly because it's fundamental to Christian doctrine. King, anointed king. Anointed with oil and anointed with God's Spirit as king. So, anointed king. So, when we speak about Jesus as Christ, we are speaking about kingship, and we're speaking about him as the descendant of David and what kind of a king he is. And the foundation for this lies here in the 2 Samuel particularly. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.